The wildfire burned green across Blackwater Bay, turning night into something that resembled hell's deepest chambers, all unnatural light and screaming souls. Stannis Baratheon's fleet, 200 warships strong, dissolved into floating pyres as alchemical fire consumed wood, sail, and flesh with the indiscriminate hunger of a substance that should not exist in any natural world. From the walls of King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister watched the carnage he'd orchestrated and felt the specific nausea of a man who'd just saved his city by creating a vision of the apocalypse. 14,000 men were burning alive because he'd been clever enough to weaponize wildfire and desperate enough to use it. He was contemplating whether history would remember him as a hero or a monster when the sky tore open, not metaphorically. The actual sky, the boundary between Earth and stars, ripped like fabric under stress, and through that tear came light that made wildfire look dim. Rainbow luminescence that shouldn't exist in spectrums visible to human eyes. And falling through that impossible radiance came a figure in golden armor, cape billowing, hammer in hand, trailing lightning like a comet trails fire. Thor Odinson hit Blackwater Bay with the force of a meteor, displacing enough water to swamp nearby burning ships and creating a wave that reached the shore. He surfaced immediately, as Guardian physiology didn't require breathing in the conventional sense, and stared at the inferno surrounding him with the dawning horror of someone recognizing a battlefield. "Enough!" Thor roared, his voice carrying across the bay with volume that made human shouting sound like whispers. He raised Mjolnir, and the sky responded with lightning that struck the water in a dozen places simultaneously. Not to kill, Thor's precision with his weapon exceeded any mortal archer's, but to generate electromagnetic pulses that disrupted the wildfire's alchemical reaction. The green flames sputtered, dimmed, and in some places extinguished entirely as physics that shouldn't work suddenly did, guided by a god who'd spent a millennium learning to weaponize storms. On the walls, Tyrion watched with the specific expression of a man whose careful plans just collided with something from mythology. "What?" he said quietly to no one in particular. "In seven hells is that?" Thor didn't hear him. The god of thunder was too busy saving drowning soldiers with the straightforward heroism that had defined him since childhood. He pulled Baratheon sailors from burning wreckage, used Mjolnir to shatter ships that were beyond saving, giving their crews a chance to swim rather than burn, created updrafts that carried men clear of the flames and deposited them on intact vessels. He saved Lannister and Baratheon forces without distinction because the concept that these drowning men were technically enemies in a political succession war hadn't occurred to him yet. They were warriors in danger. He was a warrior capable of helping. The mathematics were simple. From his flagship, now one of the few Baratheon vessels still intact, Stannis Baratheon watched the golden-armored figure command lightning and recognized divine intervention when he saw it. "Melisandre," he said to the Red Priestess at his side, and his voice carrying the conviction of a man whose faith was being validated by empirical evidence. "Is this the Lord of Light's doing?" The Red Woman stared at Thor with eyes that reflected flames she could no longer control, and felt something she rarely experienced: genuine uncertainty. The being commanding storms didn't feel like Ruller's fire, didn't carry the warmth of the Lord of Light. His power was something else entirely, old, alien, divine in ways her religion had no framework for understanding. Perhaps Melisandre said carefully. "The Lord works through instruments we do not expect." In the Red Keep, Queen Cersei Lannister watched from her chambers as a stranger single-handedly ended the battle that had threatened to destroy her family's hold on power. Her first thought was practical. Find out who he is and what he wants. Offer him anything. Gold, lands, titles, women. We need him. In the Tower of the Hand, Varys and Littlefinger watched the same scene and reached opposite conclusions. Varys saw an unpredictable element that could either save or destroy the realm, depending on who influenced him first. Littlefinger saw an opportunity, a powerful fool who didn't understand Westeros politics, ripe for manipulation by someone with sufficient cunning. And on Blackwater Bay, Thor floated above the water, cape billowing in winds he'd unconsciously summoned, and surveyed a battlefield he'd just ended without understanding what he'd interrupted. "Warriors!" he called out, his voice carrying across the bay. "Your battle is done. Where is the commander of this realm?" I would speak with whoever leads these forces and learn what threat required such desperate warfare. The question was innocent, straightforward, and demonstrated exactly how poorly Thor understood what he'd just walked into. There was no single commander, no unified threat, just political succession dressed in armor, ambition wrapped in the language of legitimacy, and a game of thrones that ground up anyone too honorable to play it properly. Tyrion, recognizing that someone needed to manage this situation before it became worse, grabbed a horn from a nearby guardsman and blew 3 sharp blasts, the signal for parley. Then he turned to his squire. "Get me down there, now, and someone fetch a boat that isn't burning." 20 minutes later, Thor stood on the shore of King's Landing, surrounded by soldiers from both sides, who'd formed a wary perimeter around the being who'd just demonstrated capabilities that made their weapons look like children's toys. He'd planted Mjolnir in the sand and stood with arms crossed, waiting with the patient expectation of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A small boat landed nearby, carrying a dwarf in fine armor, who approached with the careful body language of someone who understood he was dealing with something unprecedented. "My lord," Tyrion said, executing a bow that was correct by Westerosi standards, but looked absurd given the height differential. "I am Tyrion Lannister, Hand of King Joffrey Baratheon. On behalf of the crown, I welcome you to King's Landing and thank you for your timely intervention in our current difficulties." Thor studied the small man with the kind of assessment warriors used when evaluating potential allies. He saw intelligence in the eyes, genuine courage in the approach, despite obvious physical disadvantage, and the specific body language of someone choosing their words carefully. "I am Thor Odinson, Prince of Asgard, son of Odin Allfather," Thor replied, his introduction carrying the formal weight of Asgardian court protocol. "I arrived here through the Bifrost, a rainbow bridge that connects the 9 realms, though..." He paused, looking around at architecture that was decidedly not from any realm he recognized. "I do not know which realm this is. Your technology suggests Midgard, but the language and customs are unfamiliar. Tell me, what land is this? And what war required such desperate measures as burning men alive with sorcerous fire?" Tyrion absorbed that information. Prince of Asgard, son of Odin, arrived through a rainbow bridge and made rapid calculations about how to manage a situation where mythology had just become uncomfortably literal. "This is Westeros, my lord," Tyrion said carefully, specifically King's Landing, capital of the Seven Kingdoms. As for the war, he paused, selecting his words with the precision of someone who understood that how he framed this would define everything that followed. There is a dispute over succession to the Iron Throne. The previous king died and multiple claimants vie for the right to rule. A succession dispute, Thor repeated, his tone suggesting he found this simultaneously familiar and disappointing. So warriors die not to defend their realm from invasion, but to determine which lord sits in the seat of power. This is what required burning ships and drowning soldiers. Politics in Westeros is complicated, Tyrion said, recognizing the judgment in Thor's voice and not entirely disagreeing with it. Politics, Thor said with the specific disdain of someone whose last experience with politics involved his brother's schemes nearly destroying Asgard, is what small men do when they lack the strength to fight honorably. Where I come from, succession disputes are resolved through trial by worthiness. Show me this throne, and I will judge whether those who claim it deserve such power. Tyrion felt ice forming in his stomach. Because the most dangerous thing you could do in King's Landing was let someone powerful actually judge the throne's claimants by merit. Joffrey would be revealed as a cruel child, Cersei as a paranoid tyrant, Stannis as a rigid zealot, and the honest evaluation of Westeros's rulers would trigger conflicts that made the current war look peaceful. Of course, my lord, Tyrion said, because refusing wasn't an option when dealing with someone who commanded lightning. Though I should warn you, the Iron Throne has a certain symbolism that might prove illuminating. Shall I arrange an escort to the Red Keep? Lead the way, Thor said, pulling Mjolnir from the sand with casual ease that made nearby soldiers flinch. And explain to me why warriors fight over chairs rather than defending their people from threats that would require their combined strength. As they walked toward King's Landing proper, Tyrion began the complex task of explaining Westerosi politics to someone whose cultural framework came from divine monarchy and cosmic wars. Behind them, the Battle of Blackwater's survivors, Lannister and Baratheon both, watched the golden-armored stranger follow the imp toward the Red Keep and wondered whether they'd just witnessed salvation or the arrival of something that would make their political conflicts look quaint by comparison. In the Red Keep's throne room, servants worked frantically to prepare for the arrival of whatever the stranger turned out to be. Joffrey had been hustled to safety by the King's Guard. Cersei wasn't risking her son in front of a being whose power they couldn't measure, which meant the Iron Throne sat empty when Thor entered, his footsteps echoing in a chamber designed to intimidate through architecture. Thor stopped 10 feet from the throne and studied it with the focused attention of a warrior evaluating an opponent. The Iron Throne, forged from 1,000 swords surrendered by Aegon, the Conqueror's defeated enemies, twisted by dragonfire into a monument to martial dominance, was designed to convey absolute authority through visual representation of conquest. To Thor, who'd seen thrones made from worlds conquered and gods defeated, it looked like exactly what it was. A chair built from enemy weapons, maintained through fear, occupied by whoever could hold it through force or cunning. This, Thor said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent throne room, is not a king's throne. This is a conqueror's trophy. In Asgard, we would call one who sits here a warlord, not a ruler. Where I come from, kings earn their position through wisdom, strength, and willingness to sacrifice for their people. This chair, he gestured at the Iron Throne with Mjolnir, speaks only of victory through violence. An astute observation, Varys said, emerging from the shadows where he'd been observing. The Iron Throne was forged by Aegon the Conqueror when he united the Seven Kingdoms through dragonfire and warfare. It is indeed a monument to conquest, though whether conquest and rule can be separated is a question philosophers have debated for 3 centuries. Thor turned to study the eunuch with the same careful assessment he'd given Tyrion. "And you are?" "Lord Varys, Master of Whisperers," the eunuch replied with a bow. "I serve the realm by gathering information that helps keep the peace." "A spy master," Thor translated. "We have those in Asgard as well, though they typically operate with less visibility." He turned back to the throne. "Tyrion Lannister said there are multiple claimants to this seat. Bring them before me. I would hear their arguments and judge whether any possess the qualities worthy of rulership." Varys and Tyrion exchanged glances that communicated volumes, bringing every claimant to the throne before a being who judged by merit rather than politics would either solve Westeros's succession crisis or start a civil war that would make the current conflict look organized. "My lord," Tyrion said carefully, "the claimants are spread across the Seven Kingdoms. Gathering them would take weeks at minimum. Perhaps instead you might meet with our current king and—" "Your current king," Thor interrupted, "is clearly disputed, or there would not be a war over succession. No, I will not be presented to one claimant and expected to accept their legitimacy without hearing alternatives. That is not judgment, that is politics, and I have seen what politics does when separated from justice." He planted Mjolnir on the stone floor with a thud that echoed like thunder. "I am Thor Odinson, Prince of Asgard. I have fought wars across the 9 realms. I have defended Midgard, the realm humans call Earth, from threats that would destroy your kingdoms before you knew they existed. I have held together galaxies through strength and cities through wisdom. I will not be used as a weapon in someone's political game." The declaration hung in the air, and Tyrion realized with dawning horror that Thor had just made the same speech that every other powerful fool in Westeros made before the Game of Thrones ground them into paste. The God of Thunder was strong enough to conquer the 7 kingdoms, noble enough to refuse to be used, and apparently naive enough to think those 2 qualities would protect him from players who'd been manipulating power since before he was born. "Of course, my lord," Varys said smoothly. "We would never presume to manipulate a being of your obvious power and nobility. If you wish to judge the throne's claimants fairly, we will arrange for you to meet each one and hear their case. In the meantime, might we offer you hospitality? Chambers in the Red Keep, food and drink, time to rest from your clearly arduous journey." "I do not require rest," Thor said, though his expression softened slightly. "But I would welcome explanations. I know nothing of this realm, these kingdoms, or why honorable warriors are burning each other alive over political disputes. If I am to judge who deserves to rule, I must first understand what they would be ruling." "Then allow me," Tyrion said, seeing an opportunity to at least delay the catastrophe, to provide a tour of King's Landing and an explanation of Westeros's current political situation. It's a complicated story involving dead kings, disputed bloodlines, and enough betrayal to fill a library. Betrayal, I understand. Thor said grimly. "My brother Loki specialized in it." "Very well. Show me this realm, explain its conflicts, and help me understand what manner of ruler it needs. Then I will decide whether any of your claimants are worthy, or whether Westeros requires a different solution entirely." As Thor followed Tyrion from the throne room, Varys remained behind, staring at the Iron Throne and processing the implications of what had just occurred. A being claiming to be a god had arrived in Westeros, demonstrated powers that made conventional warfare obsolete, and declared his intention to judge the throne's claimants by merit. Every player in the Game of Thrones would attempt to manipulate him. Most would fail. Some might succeed. And if Thor actually did what he'd promised, judged the claimants honestly, Westeros would tear itself apart when they discovered that no one currently vying for power deserved it by any objective standard. "The realm has survived dragons," Varys murmured to the empty room. "It has survived mad kings and civil wars and winters that lasted generations. But can it survive a god who actually believes in justice? That, I think, is a question we're about to answer whether we want to or not." Outside, in the streets of King's Landing, where small folk had watched a golden-armored stranger command lightning and end a battle with gestures, whispers spread with the speed that rumors always did when people were desperate for hope. Some called him an avatar of the Seven. Others claimed he was a demon, and a few, remembering old stories about gods walking among men, wondered if perhaps the age of magic was returning. In the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister watched through her chamber's windows as Thor walked through the courtyard and began planning how to seduce or manipulate a god into serving Lannister interests. In Stannis' camp across the bay, Melisandre stared at the spot where Thor had commanded lightning and wondered if he was the prophesied Azor Ahai or an obstacle to that prophecy's fulfillment. And in the shadows of King's Landing's brothels and taverns, Littlefinger began spreading carefully crafted rumors designed to either control Thor through reputation or destroy him through public opinion. The Game of Thrones had just acquired a player who didn't know the rules, and everyone who did know them was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who refuses to play the game you've mastered. Thor Odinson had come to Westeros, and nothing in the Seven Kingdoms would ever be the same. The education of Thor Odinson in Westerosi politics began in the small council chamber, where Tyrion had assembled a briefing that would have made experienced diplomats weep with its complexity. Maps covered the table showing a continent divided into 7 kingdoms, each with their own histories, grievances, and claims. Family trees branched across parchments like twisted roots, demonstrating bloodlines so intermarried that determining legitimate succession required legal scholars and a tolerance for incest that made even Asgardian divine marriages look conservative. "So let me understand this correctly," Thor said, studying the maps with the focused attention of a general planning campaign strategy. The previous king, Robert Baratheon, died. His eldest son, Joffrey, inherited the throne. But multiple lords claim Joffrey is not Robert's legitimate heir because... He paused, reading the delicate language Tyrion had used. Because his mother bore him to her brother rather than to her husband, the king. "Precisely," Tyrion confirmed, impressed that Thor had grasped the central issue immediately despite its baroque complexity, which makes Joffrey a bastard born of incest, with no legal claim to the throne. Robert's brothers, Stannis and Renly, both claimed the throne should pass to them. though Renly is now dead, killed by... Tyrion hesitated. Shadow magic that apparently works in this world, despite centuries of magic being considered myth. Shadow magic, Thor repeated, his expression darkening. I have encountered such sorcery before. It typically requires blood sacrifice and serves powers that should not be invoked lightly. Who commands this magic? A red priestess named Melisandre, who serves Stannis Baratheon and claims he is chosen by her god to rule Westeros, Tyrion said. She can birth shadow assassins, see visions in flames, and apparently resurrect the dead under certain circumstances, though whether she's a charlatan with some genuine powers or an actual priestess of a real god is debated by those of us who prefer our theology less demonstrable. Thor's hand moved unconsciously to Mjolnir. Any who would use blood magic to assassinate opponents in darkness rather than facing them in honorable combat lacks the worthiness to rule. This Stannis, he permitted his priestess to murder his brother through sorcery. He did, Tyrion confirmed, though in Stannis's defense, and I use that term loosely, he genuinely believes he is prophesied to save Westeros from a coming darkness. Melisandre has convinced him that moral compromises made in service to that destiny are justified. Prophecy, Thor said, with the specific disdain of someone whose family had been nearly destroyed by prophecy-driven decisions. I have learned that those who justify present evil with prophecies of future good rarely deliver either. Cross Stannis Baratheon from the list of worthy candidates. Varys, who'd been observing from his position by the window, allowed himself a slight smile. Getting Thor to eliminate candidates was easy. The challenge would be preventing him from eliminating all of them and reaching dangerous conclusions about what Westeros actually needed. There are other claimants, Varys offered smoothly. Robb Stark, king in the north, who rejected the Iron Throne's authority after Joffrey executed his father and declared the North an independent kingdom. Balon Greyjoy, who claims the Iron Islands' independence and raids coastal settlements in the name of the drowned god. And there are whispers of a Targaryen heir across the narrow sea, Daenerys, who possesses 3 dragons and claims the throne by right of her father's dynasty. Thor's attention sharpened at one word. Dragons? True dragons or beasts called by that name? True dragons, Tyrion confirmed, pulling out a report that had arrived from Korth. 3 of them, hatched from stone eggs that were thought dead for centuries, small yet, but growing, and bonded to Daenerys Targaryen in ways that suggest she possesses genuine magical affinity beyond simple beast mastery. Then she at least has earned power through something other than politics, Thor observed. To command dragons requires strength of will and courage. Tell me more of this Daenerys. Varys produced intelligence reports detailing Daenerys's journey, sold into marriage by her brother, widowed when her husband died, walked into a funeral pyre and emerged unburnt with dragons, freed slaves in cities across Essos, conquered Astapor and Yunkai, though struggled to actually govern them afterward. She has a good heart, Varys said carefully, and genuine desire to break the wheel of oppression. She also has little practical experience in governance, a tendency toward dramatic gestures that create more problems than they solve, and advisors who range from incompetent to actively treasonous. But of all the claimants, she is perhaps the only one who genuinely believes in something beyond her own power. A warrior queen with dragons and noble intentions, but limited wisdom, Thor summarized. In Asgard, we would call such a ruler promising but unready. She would require experienced advisors and time to learn statecraft. Precisely, Tyrion said, which brings us to the fundamental problem with Westeros' succession crisis. Every claimant is flawed. Joffrey is a sadistic child. Stannis is rigid and willing to burn people alive for his god. Daenerys is inexperienced. Robb Stark is honorable but broke his oath to marry for political advantage, weakening his own position. And Balon Greyjoy is a pirate king whose idea of ruling is raiding and taking. None of them are ideal. Then none of them should rule, Thor said, with the straightforward logic that made Tyrion want to simultaneously applaud and hide under the table. If no candidate possesses the qualities necessary for leadership, the throne should remain empty until a worthy ruler emerges. That's not how monarchy works, Tyrion explained patiently. Someone must rule. The throne cannot remain empty. That's how you get chaos, civil war, and the kind of power vacuum that gets filled by whoever is most ruthless rather than most worthy. Then perhaps, Thor said quietly, monarchy itself is the problem. On Asgard, my father rules because he has proven himself worthy through 9,000 years of leadership, warfare, and wisdom. He does not rule because of bloodline alone. He rules because no one in the 9 realms is better suited to bear that burden. But here, you give power to children because they were born to the right parents, regardless of whether they possess any qualities that would justify such authority. The silence that followed was profound, because Thor had just articulated a critique of monarchy that Westerosi philosophers had danced around for centuries without ever quite voicing so directly. You're not wrong, Tyrion admitted, but you're describing a revolution, not a succession, and revolutions in Westeros tend to kill more people than they save. Before Thor could respond, a knock at the door interrupted. A servant entered and bowed. My lords, Queen Cersei requests an audience with the honored guest. She wishes to offer the crown's formal hospitality and to discuss potential arrangements for mutual benefit. Tyrion and Varys exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations. Cersei had decided to attempt manipulation through her traditional methods: flattery, seduction by proxy, and offers of power. It would fail spectacularly, but watching it fail would be educational for Thor. Please inform the Queen that I would be honored to meet with her, Thor said with Asgardian courtesy that didn't understand he was walking into a trap. 30 minutes later, Thor stood in Cersei's chambers, a room designed to intimidate through luxury, with artwork depicting Lannister victories, furnishings that cost more than most people earned in lifetimes, and the strategic positioning of a queen whose beauty had been weaponized since childhood. Lord Thor, Cersei said, her voice carrying warmth calculated to the degree. Westeros is blessed by your arrival. You saved countless lives at the Blackwater, and the crown is deeply grateful. Please sit. We have much to discuss. Thor remained standing, partly because Asgardian court protocol involved standing until the ranking royal sat first, partly because something in Cersei's performance triggered instincts honed by dealing with Loki's manipulations for a millennium. Your gratitude is noted, Your Grace, Thor said formally. Though I did not save those men for political favor, I saved them because they were in danger and I had the power to help. That is what warriors do. Of course, Cersei agreed smoothly, adjusting her approach based on his response. which is why the crown wishes to honor your noble nature with a position befitting your obvious capabilities. We would name you Protector of the Realm, give you command over the City Watch and authority to maintain order throughout King's Landing, and..." She paused for effect. "We would welcome you into House Lannister through marriage to my niece, Marguerite Tyrell, a union that would give you legitimate authority, lands, wealth, and position within Westeros's power structure." Thor processed the offer with the same analytical mind that had parsed battle strategies across the 9 realms. Position, authority, marriage, into power. It was a generous offer by any standard. It was also transparently designed to bind him to Lannister interests and ensure his considerable power served Joffrey's regime. "You offer me position in exchange for supporting your son's claim to the throne," Thor said, not as accusation but as simple observation of obvious fact. "I offer you the opportunity to bring stability to a realm that desperately needs it," Cersei corrected. "Joffrey is the rightful king. Supporting his rule means ending the war, preventing further bloodshed, and using your gifts to protect, rather than continuing senseless conflict." "And if I judge Joffrey unworthy of the throne?" Thor asked. "If I examine him by Asgardian standards and find him lacking the qualities necessary for leadership?" Cersei's expression flickered just for a moment, with genuine anger before her political mask reasserted itself. "Joffrey is young and learning. All rulers require guidance in their early years. With proper advisors and support from someone like yourself, he could become the king Westeros needs." "In Asgard," Thor said quietly, "we do not place unworthy rulers on thrones and hope they grow into the position. We identify those with the capacity for leadership and test them through trials that prove their worthiness. Your son, I have heard reports of his character, cruelty to servants, enjoyment of others' suffering, decisions made through caprice rather than wisdom. These are not qualities that improve with age or guidance. These are fundamental flaws in judgment that make one unfit to rule." "You dare," Cersei began, but Thor cut her off with the authority of a prince who'd spent 1,000 years outranking queens. "I dare speak truth," Thor said firmly. "I am not a Westerosi lord who must bow to your political power. I am Thor Odinson, Prince of Asgard, and I will not endorse tyranny simply because you wrap it in pleasant offers and political necessity. If your son is unworthy, and from what I have heard, he is profoundly unworthy, then no amount of wealth or position will make me support his claim." The mask dropped completely. Cersei's expression transformed into something cold and dangerous. "Then you have made yourself an enemy of the crown, and enemies of the crown do not fare well in Westeros, regardless of how powerful they imagine themselves to be." "Is that a threat?" Thor asked, more curious than concerned. "It is a statement of reality," Cersei replied. "You may command lightning and wield your magic hammer, but you are one man in a kingdom of millions. You cannot be everywhere, cannot protect everyone. And political power, real power, comes not from personal strength but from controlling the systems that govern realms. I control those systems, which means that regardless of your obvious capabilities, I control what happens to you." Thor studied her for a long moment, seeing past the queen to the frightened mother, protecting her son through any means necessary. It didn't excuse the threat, but it contextualized it in ways that made simple anger inappropriate. "Your Grace," Thor said, his voice softening slightly, "I understand you love your son. I understand you would do anything to protect him and see him succeed. But love does not make one worthy to rule, and protecting someone from the consequences of their actions does not help them grow into better people. Your son needs guidance, yes, but he also needs to face truth about his own character and change, or he will destroy himself and everyone around him." "Get out," Cersei said quietly, her voice carrying the specific danger of someone who'd just been offered advice she couldn't accept. "Get out of my chambers before I call the King's Guard and have you removed." Thor bowed with Asgardian courtesy that acknowledged her rank, if not her wisdom, and left. In the corridor outside, Tyrion waited with the expression of someone who'd correctly predicted a disaster and taken no satisfaction in being right. "She threatened you, didn't she?" Tyrion asked. "She attempted to," Thor confirmed. "I believe she genuinely thinks political power trumps divine capabilities. An understandable mistake for someone who has never encountered gods before." "She's not entirely wrong," Tyrion said carefully. "Thor, you can destroy armies, but can you prevent poison from being slipped into a servant's drink? Can you stop rumors from spreading that paint you as a demon or a threat? Can you protect yourself from character assassination that turns the small folk against you? Physical power is only one kind of power in Westeros, and the kind Cersei wields. Political manipulation, control of information, ability to turn public opinion can destroy you as surely as any army." Thor considered that, recognizing wisdom in the warning. "Then I need allies who understand this realm's politics, people who can navigate the systems I do not comprehend. Tyrion Lannister, would you be willing to serve as my advisor? To help me understand this Game of Thrones, so I do not fall victim to players whose strategies I cannot recognize." Tyrion froze, because Thor had just offered him exactly what he'd been maneuvering toward: position as advisor to the most powerful being in Westeros, while simultaneously demonstrating the kind of humility and willingness to learn that most powerful beings lacked entirely. "You're asking a Lannister to advise you after his sister just threatened you?" Tyrion asked. "I'm asking an intelligent man who clearly disapproves of his family's methods to help someone who wants to bring justice to a realm that desperately needs it," Thor corrected. "Your sister plays political games. You, I think, actually care about the realm beyond your family's power. Am I wrong?" "You're not wrong," Tyrion admitted. "And yes, I'll advise you. Though I should warn you, teaching you how to navigate Westerosi politics might be the hardest thing I've ever attempted. You're honorable, straightforward, and assume people mean what they say. Those are wonderful qualities that will get you destroyed in King's Landing if we don't find a way to preserve your integrity, while protecting you from those who would exploit it." "Then teach me," Thor said simply. "Show me how to distinguish genuine honor from performed honor. Help me understand which promises are real and which are weapons. And most importantly," he paused, his expression darkening, "help me determine which of Westeros's rulers, if any, actually deserves the power they claim." As they walked through the Red Keep's corridors, Tyrion began the complicated task of explaining Westerosi politics to a god. Behind them, in shadows neither noticed, Varys watched and calculated. Thor had just rejected Lannister manipulation, made an enemy of the Queen, and allied himself with her despised dwarf brother. The Game of Thrones had just become significantly more interesting and significantly more dangerous for everyone involved. The education of a god in treachery took 3 weeks, during which Tyrion Lannister earned every coin he'd ever been paid as Hand of the King by keeping Thor Odinson alive, despite the God of Thunder's determined efforts to get himself killed through honesty. "No," Tyrion said for the 17th time that morning, physically placing himself between Thor and the small council chamber doors. "You cannot walk into a meeting with the masters of coin, laws, ships, and whisperers and announce that you're judging all of them for corruption. Half of them are corrupt, Littlefinger especially, but the other half will be offended, and all of them will unite against you. Then how am I supposed to identify which lords are worthy and which are merely skilled at appearing worthy?" Thor demanded, his frustration evident in the way Mjolnir hummed with barely contained lightning. "By watching them when they don't know they're being judged," Tyrion explained patiently. "By setting up situations where their true character emerges naturally. By learning to read the space between what people say and what they mean. Thor, you're approaching this like a trial by combat, direct, honest, face-to-face confrontation. But Westerosi politics is trial by 1,000 cuts. None of them fatal individually, but collectively bleeding you dry." Thor absorbed this with the focused attention of a warrior learning new combat techniques. Over the past 3 weeks, Tyrion had taught him to recognize Littlefinger's verbal manipulation tactics, Varys's strategic information deployment, Cersei's attempts to isolate him from potential allies, and Pycelle's performance of doddering incompetence concealing sharp political instincts. But teaching Thor to recognize manipulation was easier than teaching him to accept it as normal. His Asgardian upbringing, where power came from demonstrated capability and honor was enforced through divine oversight, had left him fundamentally unprepared for a world where the most effective rulers were often the most deceptive. "This realm is broken," Thor said, not for the first time. "A system where success requires becoming dishonorable is a system that should not exist." "I don't disagree," Tyrion replied, "but destroying broken systems without having better ones ready to replace them just creates chaos that gets filled by whoever is most ruthless. If you want to fix Westeros, you need to understand it first." Speaking of which, he consulted a schedule written on actual parchment, because Thor had insisted all planning happen without electronic records that didn't exist in this medieval world anyway. "You're meeting with Stannis Baratheon this afternoon. He sailed to King's Landing under flag of truce to present his case directly to the foreign warrior god who judges worthiness." "Good," Thor said. "Stannis the First can respect. He's rigid, but rigidity in service to justice is preferable to flexibility in service to corruption." "About that," Tyrion said carefully, "there's something you should know about Stannis. He's bringing Melisandre." Thor's expression darkened. "The Shadow Priestess who murdered his brother through sorcery. Why would I grant her audience? Because she's convinced Stannis that you're either Azor Ahai, the prophesied hero who will save the world from darkness, or an obstacle to that prophecy that must be eliminated," Tyrion explained. "Either way, she wants to meet you, assess your role in her religious narrative, and possibly attempt to recruit or destroy you depending on what her flames tell her." "Let her try," Thor said with the confidence of someone who'd faced actual gods and remained unimpressed. "I have dealt with prophecy-obsessed sorcerers before. My mother was one of the most powerful magic users in the 9 realms, and she taught me to recognize when mysticism is genuine insight versus theatrical manipulation. The meeting took place in a neutral location, the Sept of Baelor, the chosen because its religious significance to the 7 worshipping population made it poor ground for shadow magic or political assassination. Thor arrived in full Asgardian regalia, Mjolnir at his side, looking every inch the divine warrior his title claimed. Stannis arrived with Melisandre, his honor guard, and the rigid posture of a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in duty and law. "Lord Thor," Stannis said, his greeting carrying none of the warmth or flattery that characterized most Westerosi noble interactions. "I am Stannis Baratheon, rightful king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. I come to present my claim to the Iron Throne and to determine whether you are friend or foe to the realm's future." "I am neither until I understand what that future entails," Thor replied, now appreciating the directness, even if he disagreed with the claim. "You say you are the rightful king. Explain why I should support your claim over others." "Because law supports my claim," Stannis said simply. "Robert Baratheon was my brother. His children are bastards born of incest. By every law of succession in Westeros, the throne passes to the eldest legitimate brother. That is me. Not because I want it, I don't, but because duty demands I claim what is rightfully mine." "You claim you don't want power, yet you murdered your brother to obtain it," Thor observed. "Renly died to shadow magic wielded by your priestess. How is that honorable succession?" "Renly was a traitor," Stannis said, his voice hard. "He claimed the throne despite having no legal right, purely because he was charming and thought himself beloved. He would have destroyed the realm through incompetent rule. His death was necessary to prevent greater harm. The Lord of Light showed us that Renly's death served a greater purpose," Melisandre interjected, her voice carrying the certainty of religious conviction. "Stannis is Azor Ahai reborn, the prophesied hero who will lead humanity through the coming darkness. All who oppose him oppose the divine will." Thor turned his full attention to the Red Priestess, and Melisandre felt the weight of a gaze that had looked upon actual gods and found them wanting. "I have heard similar claims from those who justify present evil with prophecies of future good," Thor said quietly. "My brother Loki orchestrated my banishment through prophecy manipulation, nearly destroyed Asgard while claiming divine destiny justified his actions. Tell me, my priestess, if your prophecy required burning innocent children alive, would you do it?" "The Lord of Light's path is not gentle," Melisandre replied, meeting his gaze without flinching, "but it leads to salvation. And yes, if the sacrifice of one life saves thousands, that choice is not only justified, but morally required." "Then you and I have fundamentally different understandings of morality," Thor said. "Where I come from, those who claim ends justify means typically discover that their ends never arrive, while their means destroy everything they claim to protect." He turned back to Stannis. "You speak of duty and law, but you permit your priestess to use blood magic, to burn people alive for your god, to assassinate your enemies in darkness rather than facing them in honorable combat. These are not the actions of a just ruler. These are the actions of a zealot willing to destroy his own principles in pursuit of victory." "Principles don't win wars," Stannis replied. "Pragmatism does. I don't enjoy burning people or using shadow magic, but I will use every tool available to claim the throne and save the realm from the incompetents and tyrants who would rule it otherwise. And in using those tools, you become the tyrant you claim to oppose, Thor said. Stannis Baratheon, you are not worthy of the Iron Throne. Your claim is legally sound, yes, but kingship requires more than legal right. It requires the wisdom to know which laws serve justice and which serve only power. It requires the strength to fight for what's right without compromising your principles. You have law but not wisdom, duty but not mercy. And you serve a priestess whose God demands blood sacrifice. You are not the ruler Westeros needs. The silence that followed was profound. No one in Westeros spoke to Stannis Baratheon with such direct condemnation. The man ground his teeth with fury barely contained, his hand moving toward Lightbringer, the sword Melisandre had given him, claiming it was the prophesied blade of Azor Ahai. "You dare judge me?" Stannis asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "You who arrived 3 weeks ago and claim to understand a realm you know nothing about? I have fought for 30 years to protect Westeros, held Storm's End against impossible odds, commanded fleets, administered justice without favor or corruption. And then you dismiss me as unworthy because I'm willing to make hard choices you're too soft to accept. I dismiss you because you've convinced yourself that hard choices and wrong choices are the same thing," Thor replied. "They're not. Sacrificing your honor to win the throne means you've already lost what made you worthy of it." Melisandre stepped forward, her eyes reflecting flames that weren't present in the sept. "The Lord of Light has shown me visions of you, Thor Odinson. You are not Azor Ahai, but you could be a weapon in the coming war against darkness. Submit to the Lord of Light's will, and you will serve a purpose greater than your understanding. Refuse, and you become an obstacle to humanity's salvation. I will not submit to any god who demands blood sacrifice," Thor said flatly. "And if your lord considers me an obstacle, he is welcome to face me directly rather than sending priestesses to make threats." "Then you have chosen," Melisandre said, and before anyone could react, she thrust her hand forward and spoke words in a language that predated Westeros. The air around Thor shimmered with heat that had nothing to do with natural temperature, and shadows began forming despite the sept's bright illumination. She was attempting to bind him, to wrap Thor in shadow magic the way she'd wrapped assassins, to control the god of thunder through sorcery that had dominated kings and killed rivals. The spell struck Thor's Asgardian physiology and shattered like glass against stone. Magic in Westeros worked through blood, through sacrifice, through channeling powers from gods whose nature was tied to this specific world. Thor was not of this world. His divine nature was Asgardian, his connection to cosmic forces that predated this reality's gods by eons. Melisandre's magic had no framework for affecting beings whose very existence contradicted the laws it operated under. Thor felt the attempted binding the way a human might feel, an insect landing on armored skin, present but irrelevant. His response was proportional but unmistakable. He raised Mjolnir, and lightning struck the sept's floor in a circle around Melisandre, not to harm her but to demonstrate exactly what power she was attempting to challenge. "Do not try that again," Thor said, each word punctuated by thunder that made the sept's ancient stones shake. "I have been patient with you, priestess. I have listened to your prophecies and tolerated your claims of divine mandate." but attempting to enslave me through sorcery is a line you cross at your peril. The next time you raise magic against me, I will not respond with warning." Melisandre stared at him with genuine shock. Her magic had never failed before, had never encountered resistance from beings who existed outside the framework her god operated within. She had just discovered that Thor Odinson was not only immune to her power, but represented a category of existence her religious doctrine had no ability to explain. "This isn't over," Stannis said, his hand on Lightbringer, though he made no move to draw it. "You judge me unworthy, I judge you dangerous. Westeros cannot afford foreign gods deciding who rules and who doesn't. You've made yourself a problem that will be solved." "Then solve it," Thor replied calmly. "But understand that threatening me through political maneuvering or shadow magic will fail. If you want to challenge my judgment, do it honorably. Face me in open combat. Prove your worthiness through strength and courage, rather than through priestesses and schemes. Until then, your claim to the throne remains rejected." Stannis left the sept with Melisandre, his fury barely contained, and Tyrion allowed himself to breathe again. "Well," the imp said conversationally, "you just made an enemy of the most militarily competent claimant to the throne, publicly rejected his religious advisor's magic, and demonstrated that you're immune to the kind of sorcery that has killed kings. This will have consequences." "Let it," Thor said. "I'm tired of political games and prophecy manipulation. If Stannis wants the throne, he can earn it through demonstrated worthiness rather than legal claims and shadow magic. And if Melisandre's god wants to judge me, he can do it directly rather than through priestesses who burn people alive." "You're going to start a religious war," Tyrion observed. "Melisandre has followers across Westeros. They're not numerous yet, but they're fanatical. By rejecting the Lord of Light so publicly, you've made yourself their enemy." "I have faced religious fanatics before," Thor replied. "The universe contains many gods and many who claim divine mandate. Most of them are frauds. Some are genuine. None of them justify atrocity through prophecy. If Melisandre's followers wish to challenge me, they're welcome to try. But they should understand that I am not a Westerosi lord who will fall to their schemes. I am Thor Odinson, and I do not kneel to gods who demand blood sacrifice." Over the following week, the consequences of Thor's rejection materialized in ways both predictable and creative. Littlefinger began spreading rumors that Thor was a demon from the Seven Hells, here to corrupt Westeros with false promises. Cersei attempted to have him arrested on charges of threatening the Queen, an effort that failed when the Kingsguard captain pointed out that arresting someone who commanded lightning would require a battalion and would likely destroy half the Red Keep in the process. But the most dangerous response came from an unexpected source. Varys appeared in Thor's chambers late one evening, his expression carrying the specific gravity of someone delivering information that would change everything. "Thor Odinson," Varys said quietly. "I have served the realm for 30 years by knowing things others don't. And I know something about you that you need to understand before you continue judging Westeros's rulers." "Speak," Thor said. "You've rejected Joffrey as a cruel child, Cersei as a paranoid tyrant, Stannis as a rigid zealot. And you're right about all of them," Varys said. "But in rejecting every candidate, you've created a vacuum. Nature abhors vacuums, and politics abhors them even more. The lords of Westeros are beginning to whisper that if no one is worthy by your standards, Thor felt the trap closing around him. Because Varys was right. His rejection of every candidate was creating pressure for him to provide an alternative. And the most obvious alternative was him. "I don't want the Iron Throne," Thor said. "Neither did Robert Baratheon," Varys replied. "He won it through conquest and spent 17 years being miserable as king because he preferred fighting to ruling. But want is irrelevant when duty calls. And Thor, if you genuinely believe Westeros needs better rulers than the ones currently available, refusing to be that ruler yourself is cowardice masquerading as humility." The words hit like Mjolnir to the chest, because they were true. Thor had spent 3 weeks judging every candidate and finding them lacking. But he'd never considered that his judgment created an obligation to provide what Westeros needed, rather than simply criticizing what it had. "If I claim the throne," Thor said slowly, "I become everything I came here to oppose. A conqueror taking power through strength rather than legitimate succession." "Unless," Tyrion interjected from the doorway where he'd been eavesdropping, "you don't take it through conquest, unless you do something no one in Westeros has ever attempted. You earn the throne through demonstrated worthiness rather than bloodline or victory, something that would require, well, something unprecedented." "What are you thinking?" Thor asked. Tyrion smiled, the specific smile of someone who just recognized how to turn an impossible situation into opportunity. I'm thinking that if you want to prove you're worthy of ruling Westeros while also testing whether anyone else is, there's one option that honors both Asgardian and Westerosi traditions. Which is trial by combat, Tyrion said. But not trial to determine guilt or innocence. Trial to determine worthiness. You announce that any who claim the throne, Joffrey, Stannis, Daenerys, Robb Stark, whoever, can prove their right to rule by defeating you in single combat. Not political combat, not shadow magic. Honest, open, honorable combat where strength, skill, and determination are tested. Whoever defeats you wins your endorsement, and if no one defeats you, then I've proven I'm the strongest and therefore worthy by Asgardian standards," Thor finished, while also giving everyone a chance to demonstrate their own worthiness through combat rather than politics. "It's insane," Varys observed. "It violates every principle of hereditary monarchy. It will infuriate the nobles whose power comes from bloodline rather than capability, and it will start conflicts that could tear Westeros apart." "Yes," Tyrion agreed, "but it's also the most honest succession process this realm has ever seen. And Thor, if you're going to judge Westeros by Asgardian standards, perhaps it's time Westeros experienced Asgardian justice firsthand." Thor considered the proposal, recognizing both its merit and its danger. A trial by combat for the throne would indeed test worthiness through demonstration rather than politics. It would also create chaos, as every ambitious lord with a good sword arm decided to try their luck. But chaos in service to establishing genuine justice was preferable to the corrupt peace currently maintained through lies and shadow magic. "Very well," Thor decided. "Call a great council. Summon every claimant to King's Landing and announce that the Iron Throne will be decided through trial by combat. Any who claim worthiness can prove it by facing me. Winner claims the throne and my support in ruling Westeros. And if no one defeats me..." He paused, feeling the weight of what he was committing to. Then I'll claim it myself and teach Westeros what it means to be ruled by someone who actually believes in justice. The announcement of the great trial sent shockwaves through Westeros that made the War of the Five Kings look like a minor border dispute. Thor Odinson, the foreign god who commanded lightning and had rejected every claimant to the throne, was offering to settle succession through single combat, the most Westerosi solution to a problem proposed by the least Westerosi being ever to set foot in the Seven Kingdoms. The responses came swiftly and predictably. Cersei declared it an insult to royal authority and attempted to have Thor arrested, an effort that ended when he walked through the Red Keep's main gates, surrounded by lightning, and dared the Kingsguard to try stopping him. Stannis declared it heresy against the Lord of Light's chosen path, though he also quietly began training because Stannis Baratheon would never refuse a direct challenge to his claim. The Tyrells saw opportunity and began maneuvering Margaery into position to marry whoever won. And across the Narrow Sea, Daenerys Targaryen received word that the throne her family had lost could be won through combat, and began the voyage to Westeros with 3 dragons and the conviction that destiny was finally calling her home. The trial was set for 3 months hence, giving claimants time to reach King's Landing and Thor time to prepare for what Tyrion accurately described as the most ambitious political stunt in Westerosi history, assuming it doesn't start a civil war that makes the last one look organized. But the 3 months weren't simply waiting. Thor used them to do something no foreign conqueror had ever attempted. He actually tried to understand the realm he was proposing to rule. He traveled to Flea Bottom and saw poverty that made Asgard's lowest districts look palatial, spoke with small folk who'd never met a noble who cared whether they lived or died, watched children starve while the Red Keep's feasts wasted enough food to feed districts, and felt his Asgardian sense of justice, which had been offended by political corruption, transform into genuine fury at systemic inequality. "This is what your Game of Thrones creates," Thor said to Tyrion during one such visit, watching a mother beg for bread she couldn't afford. "Your nobles play politics while people die from problems your wealth could solve in a day." "I know," Tyrion said quietly. "I've always known. But knowing and being able to change it are different things. The system is designed to concentrate power and wealth in noble hands. Trying to change that is, well, it's the kind of thing that gets reformers killed. Then perhaps Westeros needs a ruler strong enough that killing them isn't an option," Thor replied. "Someone who can impose justice from a position no one can challenge." "That's called tyranny," Tyrion warned. "Even benevolent tyranny is still tyranny. Thor, if you win this trial, and you will win because no one in Westeros can defeat you, you'll need to resist the temptation to solve every problem through force. The moment you start imposing solutions because you're powerful enough to do so, you become every corrupt ruler you've condemned." "Then help me," Thor said. "Teach me how to change systems rather than simply forcing compliance. Because if I'm going to rule Westeros, I refuse to do it the way Westeros has been ruled. This realm deserves better." The challengers began arriving 6 weeks before the trial. The first was Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, representing House Tyrell's interests and widely considered one of the finest swordsmen in Westeros. He lasted 47 seconds against Thor, before Mjolnir disarmed him with a strike so precisely controlled that the hammer stopped 1 inch from Loras's chest, close enough to demonstrate the killing blow, gentle enough to leave the young knight completely unharmed. "You fight with skill and courage," Thor said, offering Loras his hand to help him stand. "But skill alone is insufficient. Tell me, if you claimed the throne, what would you do to address Westeros's poverty? How would you reform the systems that create starvation in a land of plenty?" Loras had no answer. He was a warrior, not an administrator. The realization that Thor was testing more than combat prowess spread through the assembled lords like wildfire. This wasn't just trial by combat, it was trial by worthiness, with Thor as judge of qualities that included but transcended martial capability. The challenges continued. Knights and lords, sellswords and champions, each one testing themselves against the god of thunder. Thor defeated them all with embarrassing ease, but he never killed, never permanently maimed, and always asked the same question afterward. If you ruled, how would you make Westeros better? Most had no answer. A few had answers that revealed ambitions for personal power rather than public service, and the watching nobles began to understand something that terrified them. Thor was exposing the fundamental emptiness of Westerosi nobility. They were excellent at warfare and politics, but had never actually considered what rulership should accomplish beyond maintaining their own position. Then Stannis Baratheon entered the arena. The former claimant to the throne came without Melisandre. Thor had banned shadow magic from the trial on pain of immediate disqualification and carried Lightbringer with the grim determination of a man fighting for a cause he believed worth dying for. The combat lasted longer than any previous challenge. Stannis fought with the rigid precision that had made him one of Westeros's finest military commanders, using every technique learned through decades of warfare. But Thor had fought across the 9 realms for a millennium, had trained with warriors whose skills made mortal swordsmen look clumsy, and had Mjolnir which could be recalled to his hand and used to control combat distance in ways no conventional weapon could match. After 3 minutes of increasingly desperate combat, Thor disarmed Stannis with a lightning-enhanced strike that sent Lightbringer spinning across the arena. Then, instead of declaring victory, Thor did something unexpected. He offered Stannis his hand. "You fight with honor and skill," Thor said. "More importantly, you fight for a cause you genuinely believe in. Stannis Baratheon, you are not worthy of the throne. Your rigidity and willingness to use blood magic disqualify you, but you are worthy of respect. And Westeros needs men of principle, even flawed principle, in positions where those principles can do good rather than harm. Will you serve as master of laws in my administration? If I win this trial, will you use your understanding of justice to reform Westeros's legal system?" The offer hung in the air. Stannis had spent years fighting for the throne, convinced it was his by right and destiny. Thor was offering him something different, a chance to serve the realm in a role suited to his actual talents rather than his legal claim. "Why would you offer me this?" Stannis asked, genuinely confused. "I declared you an enemy. I would have killed you to claim the throne." "Because worthiness isn't binary," Thor replied. "You're not worthy to rule absolutely, but you're worthy of contributing to government in areas where your strengths apply. That's what wise rulers do. They surround themselves with people whose capabilities complement their own. rather than demanding absolute agreement. Stannis stood silent for a long moment, his entire identity restructuring around a new possibility. Finally, he nodded. "I accept, not because I concede your right to rule, but because serving the realm's justice matters more than sitting on a throne." The watching nobles absorbed that moment with dawning horror. Thor wasn't just conquering Westeros, he was recruiting his opposition into his government by offering them positions suited to their actual capabilities. It was brilliant, unprecedented, and threatened to completely reshape how power functioned in the Seven Kingdoms. The final challenger arrived 3 days before the trial's end. Daenerys Targaryen sailed into King's Landing Harbor with her unsullied army, her advisors, and 3 dragons that circled the city in a display that made small folk remember why the Targaryens had ruled for 3 centuries. She entered the arena not in armor but in the flowing robes of a queen. And she didn't carry a weapon because Daenerys Targaryen's weapons flew overhead and could reduce armies to ash. "Thor Odinson," Daenerys said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been tempered by slavery, widowhood, and the weight of actually freeing cities rather than simply claiming them. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful queen of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. I don't claim the throne through combat. I claim it through birthright and through having liberated thousands from slavery while your challengers played political games. My dragons and I could burn this city to ash, but I don't want conquest through terror. I want to rule through justice. So instead of fighting you, I offer alliance. Rule together or step aside and let me claim what is mine by right." Thor studied the young queen. She was perhaps 20, having lived more in those years than most experienced in lifetimes, and saw genuine fire in her eyes. Not the metaphorical fire of ambition, but the literal fire that came from being unburnt, from walking through flame and emerging with dragons. "You speak of birthright," Thor said, "but birthright is an accident of lineage. You speak of liberating slaves, and that is genuinely worthy. But liberation without sustainable governance is temporary freedom that collapses into new tyranny. Tell me, Daenerys Targaryen, what happened to the cities you freed?" Daenerys's expression flickered with pain. "They struggled. Slavery was their economic foundation. Removing it created chaos I didn't fully understand how to resolve. I made mistakes, but I learned from them. And that," Thor said, "is the beginning of wisdom. You're not worthy of the throne yet, Daenerys. Not because you lack courage or power or good intentions, but because ruling requires more than liberation. It requires the ability to build systems that sustain justice after the conqueror leaves. However," he paused, "you could become worthy with time, experience, and proper guidance. Will you accept a different role? Not as queen, but as my successor in training. You learn from advisors like Tyrion how to actually govern rather than simply conquer. Prove yourself through administration rather than through dragons. And if you succeed, if you demonstrate that you can rule with wisdom and not just fire, the throne will be yours when I return to Asgard." The offer was revolutionary. Thor was proposing what no ruler in Westeros had ever attempted: a planned succession based on demonstrated capability rather than heredity or conquest. Daenerys stared at him, her ambition warring with the recognition that he was right. She'd liberated cities and failed to govern them, had power but lacked the administrative wisdom to use it sustainably. Thor was offering her what she actually needed: time to learn rulership before the weight of it destroyed her. "I accept," Daenerys said finally, "but if you betray this promise, if you use my dragons for conquest or my cooperation for your own power, you'll discover that I am not patient with those who manipulate me." "I would expect nothing less," Thor replied. The trial by combat ended not with a final duel, but with Thor standing alone in the arena, having defeated every challenger and recruited most of them into his government. The watching nobles understood what had just occurred. Thor had won the throne not through conquest, but through demonstrated superiority in combat, combined with the wisdom to turn enemies into allies. The coronation was held 3 days later, but it looked nothing like any coronation in Westerosi history. Thor refused to sit on the Iron Throne. Instead, he had it publicly destroyed, melted down using lightning that turned 1,000 swords into molten metal, ending 3 centuries of tradition with the simple pronouncement that thrones built from conquered enemies belong in museums, not government. In its place, he established a great council, representatives from each of the 7 kingdoms, meeting regularly to govern collectively rather than awaiting royal decree. He took the title not of king but of protector of the realm, serving as final arbiter and defender, but not absolute ruler. Tyrion became hand of the council, managing the complex politics Thor had no patience for. Stannis became master of laws, reforming legal codes with the same rigid precision that had made him unsuitable for absolute rule but perfect for systematic justice. Daenerys became warden of the East, governing territories and learning administration under Tyrion's guidance, and Varys remained master of whisperers, his information networks now serving a government that actually attempted to use intelligence for public benefit rather than political manipulation. The system was imperfect, chaotic, and vulnerable to the same political maneuvering that had always characterized Westeros. But it was also the first government in the realm's history where power transfer happened through demonstrated capability rather than heredity or conquest. 18 months after Thor's arrival, Westeros enjoyed an uneasy peace. The War of the 5 Kings had ended not through victory but through transformation of what was worth fighting for. Reforms began addressing poverty, though slowly and imperfectly. The Great Council argued constantly but hadn't devolved into civil war, which by Westerosi standards counted as success. And Thor, standing on the walls of King's Landing one winter evening, watched the first snow fall and felt through his Asgardian senses that something was wrong. The snow was too early, too heavy, too infused with a wrongness that reminded him of the deepest parts of Jotunheim where ancient things slept. "Winter is coming," Tyrion said, appearing beside him with a cup of wine and the expression of someone who knew bad news was arriving. Not metaphorical winter, real winter, the kind the North has been warning about for years while the South played politics. "I feel it," Thor said quietly. "Something ancient waking, something that makes your political conflicts look insignificant." "The White Walkers," Tyrion confirmed. "Dead things animated by ice magic, led by the Night King who hasn't been seen for 8,000 years. They're why the wall was built. They're the threat the realm forgot while fighting over thrones. And they're coming south with an army of the dead that doesn't tire, doesn't fear, and can't be negotiated with." Thor gripped Mjolnir, feeling the weapon respond to his rising battle readiness. Then the Game of Thrones is over. The real war begins. The real war, Tyrion agreed, where your lightning might actually be useful, assuming ice magic doesn't counter it somehow. Thor, you united Westeros's government. Now you'll need to unite its armies, because what's coming doesn't care about who sits on thrones or what political systems we've established. It cares about ending all life, all warmth, all civilization. And it's been gathering strength while we were busy playing politics. In the far north, beyond the wall where ancient magic still functioned and the old gods watched with tree-born eyes, the Night King felt the presence of something new in Westeros, a being of lightning and storm, powerful beyond mortal measure, rallying the living to resistance. It was interesting. The Night King had faced the children of the forest, the first men, and countless generations of human warriors, but never a god. Never someone whose very existence contradicted the ice and death he represented. The coming conflict would determine whether Westeros's future belonged to the living or the dead, whether Thor's justice could survive contact with an enemy that had no politics, no honor, and no goal beyond extinction. The god of thunder had claimed Westeros's throne through worthiness rather than conquest. Now he would discover whether worthiness was enough. When facing an enemy for whom concepts like worth, honor, and justice were meaningless, winter had come to Westeros, and with it, the true test of whether Thor Odinson could save a realm he'd learned to love from a threat that couldn't be defeated with noble speeches, lightning, or appeals to honor. Some enemies could only be survived, and survival, Thor was about to learn, sometimes required sacrifices that would haunt even gods. The Game of Thrones was over. The great war for humanity's existence was beginning, and Thor, the god of thunder who'd thought he'd bring justice to a corrupt realm, stood ready to face his greatest challenge yet, leading Westeros against extinction itself. Thor Odinson claimed the Iron Throne through worthiness rather than conquest, but transformed Westeros's government from monarchy to council, and recruited former enemies into his administration through demonstrated wisdom. But now winter comes, and with it, the Night King's army of the dead. The political games are over. The true war begins, and the God of Thunder will discover whether the justice he's fought for can survive when the enemy seeks only extinction. If you want to see more characters from other universes face the political intrigue and supernatural threats of Westeros, smash that subscribe button and tell us in the comments which hero or villain you'd want to see navigate the Game of Thrones and the Great War beyond. Thor united the Seven Kingdoms. Now he must save them from annihilation. Subscribe now, because the Night King doesn't care about worthiness, honor, or justice, and teaching a god of thunder how to fight an enemy that can't be reasoned with is a story you won't want to miss. May the Force be with you. More stories await.